Virodha in Arthāpatti. The nature and development of the postulation of an unknown object. K. Kataoka. Can Virodha exist in Arthāpatti? When someone says, though Dave is so fat, I've never seen him eat, both the speaker and the listener would feel that there's something strange about that. This strangeness is expressed by the conjunction though. That is, the antecedent, Dave is fat, and the consequent, I've never seen him eat, do not connect smoothly, some friction arises between them. However, this friction is resolved by postulating, he must not eat during the day, but eats at night. The same applies to the case of Dave isn't home today, I wonder what happened to him, too. Here, the hidden antecedent, Dave is alive, 3, and the consequent, he isn't home, creates some tension. One might think, it's strange that he's alive but not here. This tension is then resolved by postulating, he must be out. So, what is the true nature of this friction or tension? In the realm of Indian philosophy, such cognition is called Arthāpatti, literally, conclusion based on the object, Chinese translation, Yizhuan, conventional translations, presumption, Selbstverständlich Folgerung. It is thought to have originally meant an indirect meaning is concluded, a patiate, based on a direct meaning understood from a sentence, Arthat, 4. An extreme example sometimes given is understanding if there are no clouds, it won't rain to imply if there are clouds, it will rain, 5. Of course, this implication is not logically correct, so it's difficult to acknowledge it as a pure example of Arthāpatti. However, the mere fact that such examples are given suggests the origin of Arthāpatti in common modes of thought. Setting aside such common modes of thought, after the 5th century CE, as epistemology was refined and systematized, Arthāpatti too became formalized as a type of valid cognition, prama. Here, artha came to refer not only to the meaning of a sentence, vakyartha, but to the object of valid cognition in general, prameya. Thus, it became, an indirect object is concluded and postulated based on a correctly cognized object. In the previous example, starting from Dave is alive, passing through he isn't home, the indirect object, he is outside, is postulated. In MMA with Macron Essay with Macron, which is concerned with Vedic exegesis and ritual teachings, Arthāpatti is established as an independent form of valid cognition irreducible to others, alongside perception, pratyaka, inference, anumana, and testimony, sabda. They explicitly state that the friction or tension expressed by though in though, yet, is Virodha, 6. In its most strict sense, Virodha refers to contradiction, the relationship between A and non-A, or incompatibility, the relationship between two terms that cannot simultaneously exist in the same substratum. However, as is immediately apparent, being fat and not eating during the day, or being alive and not being home, are not strictly contradictory. If they were contradictory, the two terms could not exist in the same person, just as Dave is alive and Dave is dead are contradictory and cannot apply to the same person. Indeed, from the perspective of Indian logic, Nyaya, Udayanacarya sharply attacks this MMA with Macron Essay with Macron position. His arguments, to be discussed later, if the antecedent and consequent contradict, one of them must be incorrect, and if both are claimed to be correct, then there must be no contradiction, perfectly express our intuition. So, what kind of Virodha does MMA with Macron Essay with Macron recognize? And, is it even claimed in the MMA with Macron Essay with Macron tradition that Virodha exists in Arthāpatti? This paper will focus on Virodha in Arthāpatti, a topic not sufficiently explored in previous research, and delve into Indian philosophical texts. 2. Interpretation of Virodha in prior research. Jha, 1978-71, first edition 1911, which marked the beginning of modern MMA with Macron Essay with Macron studies, refers to the Ba school's Arthāpatti in contrast to the Prabhakara school, stating its essence is mutual irreconcilability or inconsistency between two well-ascertained things. As he himself cites, this is based on the Sastradipika, 7. Keith, 1978-34, first edition 1921, pays attention to the resolvability of inconsistency between two facts by adding the adjective apparent. Sastry, 1961, 142, first edition 1932, building upon this, but referring to between two pramas as seen in the Manomayadaya and the Nyayakosamanjanjali rather than between two facts as in the Sastradipika, revised the ambiguous everyday expressions like irreconcilability, apparent inconsistency, and discrepancy. He reconceptualized it as a resolvable conflict rather than an irresolvable contradiction, thus logically clarifying the difference between contradiction and conflict. That is, being alive is broad, and not being home is narrow, so the relationship between the two does not strictly correspond to contradiction, A and non-A. In prior research up to this point, Virodha in Arthāpatti was logically clarified as a conflict, not a contradiction. Hereafter, in this paper, I will use contradiction for the strict A and non-A relationship, and conflict for Virodha when it roughly refers to the tension or friction between two terms without implying a strict contradiction. Alongside the logical clarification of the phase, an early tendency to view Arthāpatti psychologically can be seen in Dasgupta, 1988, 392-393, first edition 1922. Later in his life, Jha, 1964, 140, first edition 1942, added the adjective mental to inconsistency. Bhatt, 1962, who discusses the epistemology of the Bhaskul in detail, after confirming the logical phase, Bhatt, 1962, 313-314, ultimately states that inconsistency is not logical but psychological. As his reason, he cites a contradiction not between two cognitions, but between fact and our general experience. That is, while accepting the premise that being alive and not being home do not contradict but merely conflict and are resolvable, he proposes that the daily experience of Kaitra is always home when I visit his house contradicts the fact of not being home. Bhatt, 1962, 327. This position, building upon the stance that Virodha in Arthāpatti is a conflict, not a contradiction, takes the view that logically it is indeed a conflict, not a contradiction, but psychologically and experientially, contradiction is possible. Hirayana, 1993, 320, first edition 1932, has already pointed out the discrepancy with experience. Moreover, Bhatt, 1962, 339, refers to that which opposes general daily experience as something unusual or strange. As we will see later, this is an important observation related to the perspective of known and unknown. 8. In summary, the positions of prior research regarding Virodha in Arthāpatti are as follows. Jha, inconsistency, mutual irreconcilability, inconsistency between two facts. Keith, apparent inconsistency, discrepancy to be reconciled. Sastry, resolvable conflict, not irresolvable contradiction. Jha, mental irreconcilability, inconsistency. Bhatt, a feeling of tension in the mind, psychological inconsistency, contradiction between a fact and our general experience. 3. The disadvantage of Manomayadaya. In the first half of the Manomayadaya, elucidation of the means and objects of valid cognition, a well-known primer of MMA with Macron essay with Macron, Nrayabha, active around the latter half of the 17th century CE, defends the existence of Virodha in Arthāpatti. From the outset, he defines it as, when a broad cognition, Shraprama, and a narrow cognition, Astramana, conflict, Virodha, cognition concerning the non-conflicting part arises, that is Arthāpatti, MMU 120.6-7. He then assigns the cognition of being alive to the broad cognition, the cognition of not being home to the narrow cognition, and being outside to the non-conflicting part, MMU 120.8-9. However, as is already clear at this point, the Virodha he speaks of is not a strict contradiction, because contradictory pairs must occupy the same domain. Of course, he was not unaware of the strict sense of contradiction. Immediately after, he introduces an opponent from the Nyaya school who states, there is no Virodha between two cognitions, and as an example, he clarifies contradiction as an A and non-A relationship, such as this is silver and this is not silver, MMU 121.7-8. This means he knew that the Nyaya school understood Virodha in MMA with Macron essay with Macron to be contradiction. Against the Nyaya attack, he defends the MMA with Macron essay with Macron position by stating, it is not the case that there is no Virodha between two cognitions, MMU 123.9. His conclusion is, although the broad cognition is denied by the narrow cognition, it does not become a mistaken cognition because there is room for reconciliation, MMU 124.4-5. In short, in response to Nyaya's attack that there is no contradiction, he merely answers by loosening the meaning of the word Virodha, saying, even if there is no contradiction, there is conflict, so Virodha exists. Such Virodha is merely a conflict, not a contradiction in the strict sense. Thus, for Nrayabha, ultimately, there was no contradiction in the strict sense in Arthāpatti. However, his almost obsessive adherence to the expression Virodha suggests that the existence of Virodha in Arthāpatti was consciously recognized as an undeniable hallmark within the MMA with Macron essay with Macron tradition. So, is the Virodha of Arthāpatti championed in the MMA with Macron essay with Macron tradition not a strict contradiction, as Nrayabha inadvertently revealed? 4. Criticism from Udayana. When Nrayabha introduced the Nyaya scholar arguing that there is no contradiction between two cognitions, the Nyaya master he had in mind was the great scholar Udayanakarya, active around the latter half of the 11th century CE, known for his sharp critique. He logically elaborated the criticism of Virodha that had been somewhat unclearly developed by his predecessor Sridhara, active around the 10th century CE. Interestingly, as far as I know, this criticism of Virodha from the Nyayavayika lineage begins with Sridhara. Udayana states, there is no contradiction between two valid cognitions, NCUS 3.19c, 454.12, and interprets the Virodha asserted by MMA with Macron as a strict contradiction, then points out that such a contradiction does not exist. That is, he argues that the cognition of being alive and the cognition of not being home do not contradict each other. If they did, one of them would have to be wrong, just as one mistakes a rope for a snake in dim light. Or, if both cognitions are valid, then there should be no contradiction between them. Even in dim light, cognitions that perceive objects like a pole as this is thick or this is one are both correct. Two predicates that do not contradict can connect to the same subject. Furthermore, even if two predicates contradict, they can connect if the subjects are different. That is, it is impossible for the same person to be both Kaitra and Mitra simultaneously, but it is possible if the referents are different, as in this is Kaitra and this is Mitra. In this way, Udayana sharply demonstrates the incompatibility of the validity of two terms and the contradiction of two terms, while attacking MMA with Macron 9. Furthermore, he argues that for contradiction to be possible, the two terms must have a single object domain, a caveat. As Nrayabha claimed, it's not about broad cognition and narrow cognition, the two contradictory terms must have the same scope. From Udayana's clear perspective, MMA with Macron, claiming a contradiction between things with different scopes like being alive and not being home, must have appeared illogical. However, the MMA with Macron doctrine that Udayana assumes is not as simple as Nrayabha's. It seems to assert that, ultimately, contradiction in the strict sense is possible. That is, the MMA with Macron doctrine seems to be presented with the contradiction between being at home and not being at home in mind, rather than between being alive and not being home. 10. Under the condition of having a single object domain, a caveat, the contradiction, Virodha, between the two persists and becomes otherwise inexplicable, Arthāpatti. Therefore, to reconcile and explain both, they are established as having different object domains, Vibhinavyate, 11. The MMA with Macron side uses the analogy of poison, explaining that being afflicted by the poison of having a single object domain is cured by having different object domains. Specifically, under the condition of having a single object domain, being at home and not being at home contradict. So, the domain of the former is expanded to include not only home but being somewhere, including outside, as in being alive and not being home. This resolves the contradiction and pacifies it. The opponent calls such an establishment, Vyavasthapana, bringing about non-contradiction, a Virodha 12. However, the MMA with Macron rebuttal appears unconvincing. This is because, while initially stating that being at home and not being at home contradict, thus there is contradiction, when attacked with then one of them must be false, they conveniently change the content of the antecedent to being alive, which does not contradict not being at home, claiming both are true, thereby escaping the attack. Consistency is required, either consistently assert that both contradict and have a single object domain, 13, or consistently assert from the beginning that they do not contradict and have different object domains, 14. Udayana, on this point too, pierces MMA with Macron's weakness and corners his opponent. From Udayana's attack, a fairly concrete picture of Virodha in Arthāpatti in MMA with Macron emerges. According to it, Virodha is not merely a conflict as Nrayabha thought, but a contradiction in the strict sense. Specifically, being at home and not being at home constitute its content. However, the contradiction between two cognitions arises only under the condition that they have a single object domain. This contradiction is caused by the poison of having a single object domain, and under that condition, it is Arthāpatti, otherwise inexplicable. Therefore, to resolve this inexplicable contradiction and to revive the person afflicted by the poison, having different object domains is used instead of the same poison. That is, by expanding the content of the antecedent to being alive, the validity, pramaya, of the two cognitions is preserved, and non-contradiction is brought about, a Virodha.
However, the MMA with Macron theory's deception is evident, as can be gathered from its sophistical attitude of bringing forth even the analogy of poison to convince opponents of its doctrine. Such inconsistency is not permissible in logic, which presumes discussion at the same level, because what is stated before and after is clearly different. Is the content of the antecedent, in this case, being at home or being alive? Or is there some other convincing reason, besides that analogy of poison, that allows for the expansion from the former to the latter? Let us explore the circumstances from the MMA with Macron side.
V. Virodha in Arthāpatti in the history of MMA with Macron thought. Despite being an important topic concerning the essence of Arthāpatti, Virodha in Arthāpatti has not been sufficiently recognized or addressed in prior research. Instead, it has seemingly been overshadowed by the traditional debate of whether Arthāpatti is reducible to inference. The same holds true in the history of Indian philosophy. In fact, Udayana's argument mentioned earlier was developed as a prelude to the Nyaya school's assertion that Arthāpatti is reducible to inference. Looking at the discussions of Arthāpatti in the history of MMA with Macron essay with Macron thought, the problem of Virodha is by no means extensively addressed. Furthermore, representative texts that explicitly claim there is Virodha in Arthāpatti, or more specifically, the essence of Arthāpatti, the cause of Arthāpatti, is Virodha, have not been introduced in prior research. So, where should we seek the origin of the MMA with Macron essay with Macron theory presupposed by Udayana's argument? 1. Mana's view. I found the source in an unexpected place, Mana Mishra's, active around the 8th century CE, Msnukramik, compendium of MMA with Macron essay with Macron teachings, which summarizes the contents of the fundamental MMA with Macron essay with Macron text, Jaimana Sutra, in verses. Mana Mishra addresses 5 topics: cognition, action, injunction, linguistic cognition, and Brahman, discussing each in great detail in Vibramavivaka, Bhavanavika, Vidhavika, Svasiddhi, and Brahmasiddhi, respectively. Compared to these, the Msnukramik, which often condenses each intricate ritualistic discussion of MMA with Macron essay with Macron into a single pada, 8 syllables, is a book of quite a different character. Due to this nature, the book has rarely been noticed in the history of scholarship, except when discussing the chronological order of Mana's works. Nevertheless, the statements of Mana, a great MMA with Macron essay with Macron master after Kumarila with significant influence on later generations, cannot be ignored, even if they appear in his most minor work. It would not be inappropriate to assume that Udayana's awareness when attacking Virodha was primarily directed at Mana. When a valid cognition conflicts/contradicts Virodha with a valid cognition, one postulates another object, that Arthāpatti also, the revered master, says, does not deviate with respect to its own cognized object. 15. It is clear from both its expression and content that this statement by Mana is based on Virodhakara's definition, 16, cited in the Bhairabhya, 17. What is important from our current interest is that what was expressed as inexplicable otherwise, anyatha napapadiyate, in Virodhakara was explicitly clarified as Virodha of a valid cognition with a valid cognition. Dave being alive but not home is impossible otherwise, i.e., unless he is assumed to be outside, it is inexplicable. Mana clarifies our intuition, expressed by though this is strange, it's inexplicable, as Virodha. However, here we are back to square one. So, what kind of Virodha does Mana have in mind here? Is it merely a conflict of broad cognition and narrow cognition, not a strict contradiction, like Nrayabhas? Unfortunately, Mana's overly concise description does not make this clear. However, Udayana attacked a MMA with Macron essay with Macron doctrine that considered Virodha to be a contradiction in the strict sense. Does this mean Mana also envisioned a contradiction between the two cognitions of being at home and not being at home? However, the example following Virodhakara's definition, which Mana should have based his view on, only mentions being alive and not being home, saying nothing about being at home. Yet, it is unlikely that a master of Mana's stature would say something incorrect without basis. So, where should we seek his source of information? 2. Kumarila's view. The first possible source is Kumarila, active in the early 7th century CE, a great master in the history of MMA with Macron essay with Macron thought whom Mana most strongly considered, criticizing, developing, or inheriting his doctrines. However, strangely enough, the word Virodha is not even found in the Arthāpatti chapter of his Sloka Vartika, verse commentary, where Arthāpatti is discussed in detail. Does this suggest that Kumarila was unaware of the doctrine that the essence of Arthāpatti, the cause of Arthāpatti, is Virodha? Or did he know it but disregard its importance? Or did he deliberately avoid mentioning it precisely because he knew it? If so, was there some reason why he had to avoid mentioning it? First, the possibility that he was unaware is low. This is because, as we will see later, Virodha in Arthāpatti is explicitly stated in the Bhairabhya itself, which he commented on, and moreover, Kumarila comments on it in the Tantravartika, treatise on doctrine, which follows the Sloka Vartika, TB 2.2.1, 462.19-22. If so, wouldn't it be more natural to assume that he deliberately did not delve into the essence of Arthāpatti as expounded in the Bhairabhya, ignoring the traditional doctrine that the essence of Arthāpatti is Virodha, precisely because he did not want to acknowledge it? Was Virodha in Arthāpatti not a secret he wished not to touch upon in the Sloka Vartika, which aims to build a MMA with Macron essay with Macron logical and epistemological system capable of withstanding criticism from other schools? 3. Bhairabhu's view. Regarding Arthāpatti in the Bhairabhya, I have already discussed it from different angles in my previous 2 papers, Kataoka, 1996, 1998. I believe I have pointed out almost all important Arthāpatti materials within the Bhairabha. In this paper, I will re-examine the same material from the perspective of its relation to Virodha, without fearing some overlap. The Arthāpatti material within the Bhairabha can be conveniently divided into three parts. First, and most importantly, is Virodhakara's definition and example cited and introduced in the Bhairabha. This is extremely concise. Second is Arthāpatti as applied in actual discussions. This is used, for example, when discussing the cognition of phonemes, word meanings, or the Atman, and is important material for supplementing Virodhakara's concise example and fleshing out the understanding of Arthāpatti at that time. Third, and important from our current interest, are two verses quoted in the Bhairabha. Note that these verses are quoted in the context of asserting the principle of minimal postulation of an unknown object, which is stated at the end. An object that has not been seen or heard is understood not to exist. However, this is only if what has been seen or heard does not conflict/contradict, na virudyate, when that, the unseen or unheard object, does not exist. If it conflicts/contradicts, virudyamane, something must be postulated. By that, the postulated thing, that, the seen or heard thing, becomes purposeful. If no difference, between postulating n items and n+1 items, is understood, not even one more is postulated. 18. As is immediately apparent, the core here is the opposition between what has been seen, da, and what has not been seen, ada, and what has been heard, sruta, and what has not been heard, asruta. To improve clarity, let's rephrase the above verse by substituting known object and unknown object. First, an unknown object is understood not to exist. However, such an understanding is permitted only if the known object does not conflict even if the unknown object does not exist. If it conflicts, an unknown object is postulated, and through it, the Virodha of the known object is resolved. However, the postulation of an unknown object should be minimal, this would be the structure. Now, let's expand this into a concrete image based on the example of postulating being outside that Virodhakara provided after his definition. The unknown object to be postulated would, needless to say, be Devdutta's being outside, Barbar Bhava. This implies that an unknown object is understood not to exist means that the possibility of Devdutta being outside is excluded beforehand, and he is considered not to be outside. If we take the example literally, as Virodhakara states, when Devdutta is alive, Javati Devadat, the known object would be being alive. The third point, if the unknown object does not exist, the known object conflicts, means that if Devdutta is not outside, then being alive contradicts not being home. Since being alive if Devdutta is not outside essentially means being at home, it becomes being at home contradicts not being at home. That is, the Virodha in this case is a strict contradiction. In this way, when the known object being alive, though it is qualified as being alive if one is not outside, falls into contradiction, being outside, an unknown object, is postulated to resolve it. The world of known and unknown presupposed by this verse, as I showed in my two previous papers, is not a world where known and unknown are equivalent opposites, but one where the known is near and the unknown is distant. If we represent this in a diagram, the known world occupies the center of two concentric circles, and the unknown world occupies the outer part. The world where an unknown object is understood not to exist, declared first by the verse, is a world where the unknown world on the periphery of our possible world is cut off, that is, a familiar world occupied only by known objects. In that known world, Devdutta being alive means only the familiar domain one is used to seeing, i.e., being at home. In reality, we see Devdutta being at home and understand that he is alive. However, this familiar known world encounters the unusual situation of Devdutta not being at home and falls into Virodha. The Virodha in this case is a strict contradiction, i.e., the contradiction between being at home and not being at home. We, who had been resting comfortably in the known world, now see our previously reliable worldview collapse. Therefore, to construct a new worldview that accepts and explains even the unusual situation of not being at home, we expand our worldview from the known world to the unknown world. That is, we broaden Devdutta being at home to being alive, somewhere, either at home or outside. By doing this, we postulate, he must be outside, somewhere, and by incorporating the unknown object into our cognitive world regains stability. In this way, the two verses express the dynamism of our worldview expanding from the known to the unknown. 6. Conclusion, Virodha in Arthāpatti and known and unknown. Now, how is Virodha in Arthāpatti, our concern, explained in these two verses? Furthermore, what was the mechanism that made contradiction as Virodha possible? The key lies in the first statement, an unknown object is understood not to exist. Without the premise an unknown object is understood not to exist, the known object being alive would not contradict not being home, and one would merely end up idly bandying about the term Virodha, like Raya Ba. On the other hand, if one accepts that premise, the possibility of an unknown object is excluded, and the known object, being alive, means only being at home, making a strict contradiction with not being at home possible. Thus, this double standard, where contradiction exists in the known domain, and contradiction is resolved in the expanded world including the unknown domain, was the mechanism that made contradiction possible and simultaneously resolved it. Udayana criticized this level shifting and reproached MMA with Macron for not deciding whether to remain in a single object domain or different object domains. Udayana's criticism is correct. However, that is true only when one argues purely logically on the same plane, without introducing the framework of known and unknown. But in the everyday world, it's not like that. We adopt a cognitive method of separating known and unknown, managing within the known world, and incorporating a part of the unknown world when we encounter difficulties. Such everydayness, though it may seem surprising, also applies to MMA with Macron, which is the exegesis of Vedic scriptures, often contrasted with everyday life, loka. For them, who placed the framework of known and unknown at the center of their epistemology, the transition from the known world to the unknown world was something fundamental to their epistemology. As described above, Virodha, the essence of Arthāpatti, is established only when supported by the framework of known and unknown. That is, in Arthāpatti, first, in the known world that excludes the unknown domain, a contradiction arises. Udayana's having a single object domain corresponds to this stage. On the other hand, when the cognitive world is expanded to include the unknown domain, the contradiction is resolved. This is the stage of having different object domains. At this stage, that is, from the viewpoint that includes the unknown domain, what was previously perceived as contradiction is not a strict contradiction. It is merely a conflict between broad and narrow cognitions. 7. Supplement, Kumarila's intention and subsequent developments. Finally, let's speculate about Kumarila's intention in the Sloka Vardika, which remains an unresolved issue, and depict the growth of Virodha as it permeates the history of MMA with Macron thought. As already mentioned, Kumarila briefly comments on the two verses in the Bharavya. Even though they are included in the portion of the Bharavya commented on by the Tantra Vardika, not the part commented on by the Sloka Vardika, it is unlikely that he was unaware of these two verses or the traditional doctrine that the essence of Arthāpatti is Virodha. Moreover, the relevant passage of the Bharavya that the Arthāpatti chapter of the Sloka Vardika comments on, i.e. Vyardhakara's definition and example, indicates the cause of Arthāpatti is because it is otherwise inexplicable, anyathanappapadayata iti. Against this, Kumarila could have pointed out that the essence of anyathanappappati is Virodha. However, he did not. Is it not the case that, although he knew the traditional doctrine that the essence of Arthāpatti is Virodha, he did not want to touch upon it? As stated previously, to argue that contradiction functions in Arthāpatti, one had to presuppose a double standard, the transition from the known world to the unknown world. On the other hand, Kumarila was compelled to demonstrate to the Nyaya school that Arthāpatti is not reducible to inference. To counter Nyaya's inference, it must have been necessary to present it purely logically. Indeed, he painstakingly attempts to show that Arthāpatti does not meet the necessary conditions for inference. In such a context, introducing the framework of known and unknown, dragged from the everyday world, and saying, there is contradiction in the known world, and no contradiction in the unknown world, would surely not be accepted by the Nyaya school, which focuses on the opposition of truth and falsity and does not emphasize the framework of known and unknown in its epistemological system. In reality, this was seen in Udayana in the history of controversies. Given these circumstances, Kumarila might have thought it was not a good strategy to bring up Virodha in Arthāpatti in the context of a strict logical and epistemological system, and therefore deliberately avoided mentioning it. However, despite Kumarila's intention, the doctrine of Virodha in Arthāpatti seems to have been inherited within the MMA with Macron tradition. Mana, a MMA with Macron master following Kumarila, pointed out Virodha as the essence of Arthāpatti even within the limited number of characters of a single verse. In the Prabhakara school, another MMA with Macron tradition alongside the Ba school, Salakanatha, active around the 9th century CE, mentions Virodha of Arthāpatti, pp 106.6-7. Perhaps due to Kumarila's confidentiality, this point was not questioned by other schools until Sridhara, active around the 10th century CE. It is surprising that information-rich scholars like Jantaba, active in the latter half of the 9th century CE, Basarvajna, active in the 10th century CE, and Vakaspati Mishra, active around the 10th century CE, do not mention it. The Ba scholar Parthasarthi, active in the early 11th century CE, seems to have noticed the awkwardness and expressed it as pratigata, conflict, seemingly avoiding strict contradiction. It was only with Udayana, active in the latter half of the 11th century CE, that the doctrine that the essence of Arthāpatti in MMA with Macron is contradiction was exposed, despite Kumarila's efforts. Thereafter, within the MMA with Macron tradition, similar to Parthasarthi, the circumstances of Virodha being a strict contradiction seem to have been forgotten, and the view that it is a conflict, accepting Udayana's criticism, spread. Nrayabha, for example, while clinging to the traditional doctrine that there is Virodha, essentially changed the content of that Virodha from contradiction to conflict.